There's a sentence Hayden Panettiere said, almost in passing, in one of the last interviews she ever gave, that changes the way you have to look at her entire life. She said that if the people she worked with told her to jump, she jumped. If they told her to wear something, she wore it. She trusted them more than she ever trusted herself.
I was 18, even though I'd lived such a huge life and I thought I was so mature at 18, scientifically, her frontal lobes don't develop until we're 20, 26, 25, 26. So even though I felt like I could make healthy decisions, safe decisions, I wasn't capable of being fully aware of what was going on around me. And it wasn't until I found myself in predicaments that I realized my perspective completely shifted, and I realized that I was in danger. But by the time I'd realized I was in danger, I was quite literally out to sea.
Most people would hear that and think, sure, that's just what it means to be famous. You follow instructions, you do your job. But sit with it a little longer, and it starts to sound like something else entirely. Because Hayden wasn't describing a workplace habit she picked up as an adult. She was describing something built into her long before she could really understand what was happening to her. She was in commercials before she was a year old, working steadily by 5, a household name as a teenager. Which means the instinct she's talking about, the one where she overrides her own judgment in favor of whatever the adults around her are telling her, wasn't a decision she made. It was trained into her during the exact years a person is supposed to be learning the opposite. How to know when something feels wrong, and what to do about it. Once you understand that, a lot of the things Hayden later revealed about her life stops looking like a list of unfortunate, unrelated incidents. They start looking like consequences. A boat, a room downstairs, pills before a red carpet, a kiss she didn't ask for that she chose to brush off instead of make into a scene, an exposure she initially tried to explain away as a bad joke. Different situations, different people, years apart, but run through the same mechanism, the one she described in that interview. Trust them, not yourself. That's the story this documentary is actually about. Not a scandal, not a mystery to be solved, but a system, and what it produces when you raise a child inside it for their entire life before they're old enough to have a say in it. Hayden Panettiere spent decades being one of the most recognizable faces on American television. For almost all of that time, the public version of her story was the simple one. Child star, breakout role, a few rough years, a comeback. It's only in her final chapter, through interviews, through the memoir she released in 2026, through moments where she stopped performing and just talked, that a very different version of that story started to surface. One she was the only person who could actually tell. This is that story, in the context she was finally starting to give it, right before her voice went quiet for good. To understand how someone ends up describing their own life in those terms, jump when they say jump, wear what they say wear, you have to go back further than the fame, further than heroes, further than the magazine covers, further than any of the moments most people associate with her. You have to go back to before she could form long-term memories. Hayden Panettiere was appearing in commercials before she turned 1. By the time she was 5, acting wasn't something she did occasionally. It was regular work, a job, with hours and expectations, and adults deciding what came next. Most people spend childhood building something that resembles an internal compass, a slowly developing sense of what feels right and what doesn't, tested first against small stakes, then bigger ones, until by adolescence, there's usually some baseline instinct for when a situation is off. Hayden spent those years somewhere else, not building that compass, performing, being directed, being told, professionally, by adults whose job it was to shape her into whatever a role required, what to do with her face, her voice, her body, her emotions. And she felt it happening in real time, even as a child. In one of her own accounts, she described standing in her room around age 12, having what she called a total identity crisis, after years of auditioning and acting, unsure of who she actually was underneath it all. That's not a typical complaint from a 12-year-old. Most 12-year-olds don't wrestle with who they are underneath the roles they've been performing since infancy, because most 12-year-olds haven't been performing since infancy. It's tempting to hear child star and picture the familiar cautionary tale, too much money, too much attention, a kid who couldn't handle the pressure. That's not quite what Hayden was describing. She wasn't describing pressure from an external spotlight so much as an internal blank space, sitting exactly where a developing sense of self should have been. That distinction matters. It sets up almost everything that comes after it. By her teenage years, that early foundation had become a full career. She appeared in Remember the Titans. Then, still a teenager, she landed the role that would define her public identity for years. Claire Bennett on Heroes, one of the biggest shows on television at the time, which turned her, almost overnight, into one of the most recognizable young actresses in the country. From the outside, this looks like the success story, the girl who made it. But according to Hayden, the machinery that got her there didn't stop once the fame arrived. If anything, it intensified, because now there was more at stake. More people whose careers depended on her compliance. More reasons for her to keep doing exactly what she was told. It's in that environment, a life built entirely on taking direction from adults, dating back to before she could consciously object to any of it, that Hayden says the specific incidents happened. Not as isolated bad luck, as what that environment, left unchecked long enough, tends to eventually produce. The first one she described happened when she was 18. According to Hayden, she was invited onto a boat by someone in the industry she had grown to trust. Someone she has said she genuinely viewed as a protector, not a threat. It's worth sitting with that detail before going further, because it's the detail that recurs across nearly every story she eventually told. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't someone she had reason to be cautious around. This was, by her own account, someone inside the same system that had raised her. Someone she had, in a sense, been trained to trust the way she'd been trained to trust everyone in that world. Implicitly, without much room for her own instincts to weigh in. At first, she says, nothing about the boat felt wrong. Then, at some point, this person led her downstairs, into a small room. What she describes next is this. She was brought into that room and placed in a bed next to an undressed man. Someone well-known, someone she describes as very famous. A moment, she has said, triggered something in her almost immediately. Some internal alarm switching on despite everything she'd been taught about deferring to the adults around her. She got out. She spent the rest of the time on that boat trying to find somewhere to hide. She has never named the man. She has never named the person who brought her downstairs. And she has been fairly direct about why. Because, in her words, some of the people involved in these stories are still powerful, still working in the same industry she spent her life inside. That single choice, describing what happened without naming who it happened with, deserves its own moment of attention, because it tells you something the incident itself can't. If a person who has, by any measure, built enough of a public platform and enough personal courage to describe an assault involving a famous man on a boat still calculates that identifying him isn't safe, that's not really a detail about Hayden. That's a detail about the environment she's describing. It suggests that even at the very end of her life, even with seemingly little left to protect professionally, the risk calculation around powerful men in that industry hadn't meaningfully changed since she was 18. We don't get to know who was on that boat. What we get is her account of what happened there, and the fact that, decades later, she still didn't feel safe enough to say more. The pattern didn't stop there. Hayden also described an experience involving drugs, tied to the same trust dynamic. Before one of her red carpet appearances, she says someone close to her, someone she trusted, again, someone positioned as being there to help her, gave her pills, framed as something that would give her energy and help her get through the appearance. By her own account, she didn't question it much at the time. Not because she was careless, but because, once again, the person handing them to her was someone her entire upbringing had trained her to trust more than she trusted her own hesitation. This is the moment that ties directly back to the sentence in the hook. If they told me to jump, I jumped. If they told me to wear this, I wore that. I trusted them more than I ever trusted myself. She wasn't offering that as a general observation about fame. She was offering it, in context, as an explanation for how a teenager ends up taking pills from an adult without asking many questions. The instinct to comply, to trust the adults around her over her own judgment, wasn't limited to wardrobe and blocking. It extended into decisions about her own body, decisions most people would want a young person to be able to make carefully, for herself. There's a version of this story that could stop right there and already be worth telling. But Hayden kept going, and the incidents that followed complicate the picture even further. Not by adding shock value, but by showing how the same dynamic played out in smaller, quieter, more socially normalized ways too. At an industry party in 2008, when Hayden was 18, an unnamed executive from the network she worked with approached her and kissed her on the lips, without asking. She has said she didn't make a big deal out of it in the moment. She brushed it off and kept moving. The person she was with at the party saw it differently and wanted to confront the executive. Hayden told them not to. Stop and consider the asymmetry in that moment. She was 18. She hadn't asked for the kiss. She had done nothing to invite it. And yet she was the one managing the situation, the one calming things down, the one absorbing the discomfort so that nobody else's evening or career would be disrupted by it. That's not a coincidence, and it isn't really about this one executive either. It's the same trained reflex, showing up in a completely different context. Don't make waves, don't trust your own reaction enough to act on it. Keep things moving smoothly for everyone else. A year later, around age 19, at another industry gathering full of well-known people, Hayden says she was already feeling uncomfortable and had decided it was time to leave. While she was putting her coat on, a man approached her, someone she has described as a highly respected, Oscar-winning actor and director, and used a story involving a piece of gum to get her to look down. When she did, she says his pants were open and he had exposed himself to her. She has said the moment didn't physically harm her, but it left her shocked and confused. She initially tried to explain it away as some kind of drunken joke. She didn't tell the person she was with. In her words, the moment had already passed, so there didn't seem to be a point. 3 separate incidents, 3 separate men. Years apart, different settings, different levels of severity, but run through the same underlying pattern. Someone she had reason to trust, or at least no specific reason to distrust, doing something that violated that trust. And Hayden, in the moment,
there was nobody who was going to be empathetic to my situation, that this was nothing new to them.
I mean, it's such a horrifying event to go through and to be put in that position at 18 years old.
And disappointing when somebody lets you down like that. And I'd been let down so much before, and that when you really find somebody that you trust, like, you hold on to them for dear life and you feel so...
Minimizing it, managing it quietly, protecting everyone else's comfort before her own. None of these stories, on their own, prove a conspiracy or a coordinated cover-up. What they demonstrate, together, is a consistent, trained response, the same one she named directly in that interview, showing up across a decade of her life, in wildly different situations, with different people. That consistency is the actual story here. Not any single incident, but the pattern connecting all of them. Before going further, it's worth being clear about what this documentary can and can't tell you. Everything you've just heard comes from Hayden's own accounts, interviews she gave, and her own memoir. None of the men involved have been named by her, publicly identified through other reporting, or given the opportunity to respond, because their identities were never disclosed. That means these are her accounts of her own experiences, not independently verified incidents involving named, accountable individuals. That distinction doesn't make her account less worth taking seriously, but the honest way to treat this material is as testimony, a first-person record of what someone says happened to her, rather than as established fact about specific, identifiable people. That's a line this documentary intends to hold throughout. It's worth pausing here to ask a broader question, because Hayden's account, as specific as it is to her, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits inside a much older, well-documented pattern of how the child performer system is actually built. When a child starts working professionally, the adults around her generally fall into a small set of roles, a parent or guardian, who is often financially dependent on her income in a way that complicates their ability to act purely as a protector, a manager or agent, whose livelihood is tied directly to her continuing to book work, and a rotating cast of producers, executives, and other industry figures whose interest in her is professional, not personal. In theory, these roles are supposed to check each other. In practice, according to the accounts of many former child performers over the years, they often blur into a single, undifferentiated category in a child's mind. The adults, the people who know better, the people you listen to. A child who is working, rather than simply living, doesn't necessarily have the developmental space to sort out which of those adults is acting in her interest. and which is acting in the interest of a paycheck, a show, or a studio. Hayden's description of trusting instructions over instinct isn't a personality trait unique to her. It's close to a documented occupational outcome of that structure, repeated across different studios, different decades, and different performers who otherwise share very little in common. That doesn't make any specific claim in her account more or less verifiable, but it does mean the pattern she's describing has a name, a history, and a track record. This isn't the first time it's surfaced, and industry insiders and former performers alike have been raising versions of this same structural critique for years. If you're finding this pattern as unsettling to trace as we did putting it together, that's probably a good moment to make sure you don't lose the rest of it. Alder builds these investigations piece by piece, and there's more ahead that reframes even the parts of Hayden's story most people think they already know. If that's useful to you, liking this video and subscribing to the channel with notifications turned on means you won't miss where this goes next. Because the trust dynamic Hayden described didn't only show up in isolated incidents with individual men. It shaped her entire relationship with the industry itself, including the parts that looked, from the outside, like pure success. Take Nashville. Between 2012 and 2018, Hayden starred in the show as Juliet Barnes, a young country singer navigating fame, addiction, public pressure, and eventually postpartum depression. On paper, this is the kind of role actors call a gift. Meaty, emotionally demanding. The sort of part that lets someone show range and earns real acclaim. Hayden was genuinely good in it. Critics noticed. Audiences responded to Juliet in a way that made her one of the show's defining characters. A young star whose public unraveling was, within the fiction of the show, treated as compelling television. But here's where the story stops being simple. By Hayden's own account, during the years she was playing Juliet's spiral into addiction and postpartum depression on screen, she was privately experiencing versions of the same things off-screen. Real addiction, real postpartum depression, after the birth of her daughter. She has said, directly, that she eventually struggled to know where the character ended and she began. Think about what that actually required of her, week to week, for 6 seasons. A writer's room would draft scenes of Juliet's addiction unraveling her relationships, her career, her sense of self. Hayden would then have to report to set, get into costume, and perform that unraveling convincingly enough to satisfy a network, a director, and an audience, often while managing a version of the same unraveling in her own life, off camera, largely alone. Then the same thing would happen with the postpartum depression storyline. A fictional new mother, played by a real new mother, both of them working through the same territory on parallel tracks, one of them getting notes on how to make the performance more convincing. That's worth taking literally, not as a poetic flourish. There's no way to prove causation here. No way to say definitively that playing Juliet caused Hayden's real struggles, or that her real struggles simply happened to overlap with a role that mirrored them, or that the writers were drawing on things they observed in her and feeding them back into the character, creating an unintentional feedback loop where the show and the life kept informing each other. All three are plausible, and they aren't mutually exclusive. What isn't in dispute is that she experienced the overlap as disorienting and destabilizing enough to comment on it directly, years later, with no professional incentive left to flatter the show that made her. This is where the trust the adults over yourself pattern shows up again, in a different form. An actor in that position, under contract, financially dependent on the role, surrounded by a production that benefits from her staying in character, staying compliant, staying available, isn't necessarily positioned to say, "I think this part is bad for me right now. I need distance from it." Saying that out loud means walking away from a steady, high-profile job, disappointing a cast and crew who depend on the show continuing, and risking the kind of reputation that gets an actor quietly labeled difficult. The same instinct that got her out of a room on a boat but kept her silent about it publicly for years, the same instinct that had her brushing off an unwanted kiss to keep the peace, would plausibly make it very hard to walk away from a hit show simply because the character felt too close to her real pain. Nobody around her necessarily did anything wrong by casting her, or by writing the character the way they did. But the environment that made it hard for 18-year-old Hayden to name a man on a boat is the same environment that would make it hard for an adult Hayden, years later, to say she needed to step back from a role, eating into her mental health. Different stakes, same underlying structure. That structure had consequences outside the show too. At one point, Hayden spoke publicly about her postpartum depression, an honest, by most accounts commendable act of openness about something many parents go through privately and silently. The response from one of her longtime commercial partners, Neutrogena, a brand she'd worked with for around a decade, was to end the relationship, citing what she has described as an immorality clause. Her team pushed back, and she ultimately saw out the existing contract term, but the relationship was effectively over after that. Sit with the mechanics of that for a second. A skincare brand's morality clause, the kind of clause typically written to protect a company from a spokesperson's scandal, criminal behavior, or public controversy, was apparently applied to a woman disclosing a real, common, medically recognized mental health condition after childbirth. That's not a rumor or a secondhand allegation, it's Hayden's own account, and if accurate, it's a fairly direct illustration of the same lesson she'd apparently been absorbing her whole career. The honest version of yourself is a liability. Keep performing the acceptable one instead. It's worth noting how efficiently that message reinforces everything that came before it. A childhood spent learning to trust others over her own instincts had already taught her that compliance was safer than honesty. A brand relationship ending the moment she was honest about a mental health struggle would only confirm the lesson. Performing wellness was rewarded. Admitting to a real struggle was not. By 2026, Hayden had clearly reached a different point in her life. One where she seemed less interested in managing everyone else's comfort and more interested in telling the full story, on her own terms. She released a memoir titled, "This Is Me, A Reckoning." The title alone signals the shift. Not a highlight reel, not a comeback narrative, but a reckoning. An attempt to close the gap between the person the public thought it knew and the person she says she actually was underneath. The book covered the incidents already described here, but it went well beyond them, and each of the threads she picked up deserves more than a passing mention. She wrote about her addiction, tracing it back to being introduced to pills as a teenager working in the industry, not framing it as a single bad decision, but as the slow, almost invisible normalization of using substances to get through a schedule no teenager should have been keeping in the first place. She wrote about her postpartum depression not as a brief, resolved chapter, but as something that reshaped how she understood her own mind, forcing her to separate, for the first time, what she was actually feeling from what she had spent a career learning to perform on command. She wrote about abusive relationships, describing patterns of control and manipulation that, again, echo the larger theme running through her account. A woman who had been taught since infancy to defer to the people closest to her, finding herself, as an adult, in relationships where that same deference was exploited. And she wrote about body dysmorphia, the specific, corrosive effect of being publicly evaluated, photographed, and commented on for essentially her entire life, starting from before she could remember a version of herself that existed outside of being watched. Taken together, these aren't separate problems that happen to affect the same person. In the way she described them, they read as different expressions of the same root condition. A life that began without the chance to develop a private, unobserved sense of self, and the long, difficult work of trying to build one decades later, in public, after most of the damage had already been done. When Hayden talked, later in life, about not believing everything you see in a picture, she wasn't offering a vague, inspirational platitude. She was describing, specifically, the distance between the actress on magazine covers and red carpets and the reality she says was happening underneath that image the entire time. It's a distance a lot of people who grew up in front of cameras have described, but rarely with this much detail, and rarely this close to the end of their own life. It's tempting, at this point in the story, to treat everything Hayden described as a single, unbroken narrative of victimhood, one continuous thread from infant commercial actress to traumatized adult, with no room for anything else. That would be too simple, and it would do her account a disservice. Hayden didn't describe her life that way. Alongside the difficult material, she talked about hope, about resilience, about finally starting to feel like herself. She spoke about it directly in one of her final conversations, with Jay Shetty, saying she felt like there was a lot more life left to live, that she could feel real possibility opening up again. That's an important counterweight to hold alongside everything else in this story. The woman describing a childhood built on trained compliance and a series of disturbing incidents with powerful men was also, by her own account, in one of the more hopeful chapters of her adult life when she gave some of these final interviews. Those two things existing at the same time, hard-won hope and unresolved trauma, aren't a contradiction. They're closer to what recovery actually tends to look like for most people. Not a clean resolution, but ongoing work, held alongside real progress. Hayden Panettiere died on August 16, 2026, at 36 years old. She was found unresponsive at an apartment in Greenville, South Carolina, and pronounced dead at the scene. As of this recording, an official cause of death has not been determined. Authorities have stated there are no signs of trauma and that no foul play is suspected, while the investigation continues. It would be easy, in a documentary built around unanswered questions, to lean into the ambiguity of an undetermined cause of death and let the story imply something it hasn't earned. This documentary isn't going to do that. Nothing in the public record suggests anything other than what authorities have said: no signs of trauma, no suspicion of foul play, a cause of death still pending, which is common and unremarkable in the days and weeks following a sudden death, particularly one involving someone with a documented history of addiction and postpartum depression. The tragedy here doesn't need embellishment or implied mystery to be significant. It's significant on its own terms. A woman who spent her entire life being watched by an industry that rarely, if ever, watched out for her, died at 36, not long after finally starting to tell her own story honestly, and not long after saying, in one of her last recorded conversations, that she felt like she had a lot more life left to live. In the days that followed her death, the usual machinery of public mourning moved quickly. Clips from her final interviews circulated widely, often stripped of context, condensed into short, emotionally charged fragments designed to be watched quickly and shared quickly. Tribute posts from former co-stars and industry figures arrived within hours. Retrospectives ran through her career highlight by highlight. The early commercials, Remember the Titans, Heroes, Nashville, the awards and nominations, the magazine covers. It's worth naming that reflex directly, because it's part of the same pattern this documentary has been tracing from the beginning. The same industry and the same public appetite that spent decades consuming Hayden Panettiere as an image, a face on a screen, a name in a headline, a character to root for or worry about, moved just as quickly to consume her death the same way, reducing a complicated, still unfolding personal reckoning into a tidy, shareable tribute. That's not a criticism of any one person who posted about her. It's an observation about how easily even genuine grief gets absorbed into the same machinery that shaped her entire life, watched, packaged, and moved on from. There's a fair, necessary counterpoint to raise before drawing this together. Everything presented here is built on Hayden's own retrospective account of her life, given largely in interviews and a memoir written during a period of real personal difficulty and, later, recovery. That doesn't make her account untrue. But it's worth acknowledging honestly that memory, especially memory revisited during a period of processing trauma and rebuilding a sense of self, isn't a neutral recording device. People re-narrate their pasts in light of where they've ended up. And that's not dishonesty. It's simply how human memory and meaning-making work. Addiction and postpartum depression, in particular, have complex, multi-causal origins that go well beyond any single industry or upbringing. Genetics, individual circumstances, and countless other factors play a role this documentary can't and shouldn't claim to fully untangle. And because none of the men involved in the incidents she describes have been named, there's no way to independently corroborate specific details, timelines, or context that might complicate the picture further. None of this is offered to discredit what Hayden said. It's offered because a documentary that only tells you the version of the story that feels satisfying isn't actually being honest with you, and this one is trying to be. What remains true, even accounting for all of that, is the pattern itself. Not any single incident in isolation, but the through line connecting a child put to work before she could talk, a teenager trained to override her own instincts in favor of whoever was giving instructions, and an adult who spent years managing, minimizing, and quietly absorbing situations that should never have required management or minimizing from an 18 or 19-year-old in the first place. That pattern doesn't depend on any one unnamed man being confirmed to be worth taking seriously. It's visible in the structure of her entire career, in the Neutrogena decision, in 6 years spent playing a character whose collapse mirrored her own, in the simple fact that a woman speaking publicly at the very end of her life still felt she couldn't safely say who had done what to her. It's a pattern other former child performers have described for years. In different industries, different decades, different specifics. Kids surrounded by adults whose job, officially, was protection, and whose actual incentives often ran in a very different direction. That's probably the most honest place to leave this. Not with a solved mystery, because there isn't one to solve here, and manufacturing one wouldn't honor what Hayden Panettiere actually spent her final years trying to do. Tell the truth as clearly and specifically as she could, on her own terms, without needing to name every name to make the pattern visible. The unresolved question this documentary leaves you with isn't about her death. It's about the industry she described spending her entire life inside. How many people are living through some version of that same pattern right now? Unnamed, unheard, still young enough that the adults around them are the only source they've ever been taught to trust. Hayden spent most of her life being watched. Toward the end of it, she finally started being heard. Whether the industry she described has actually changed, or has simply gotten better at appearing to, is a question her account leaves open, and one worth sitting with long after this video ends. If this is the kind of investigation you're glad exists, one that takes a hard subject seriously without inventing certainty it hasn't earned, subscribing to Alder and turning on notifications means you'll be here when the next one goes up.